Salutations from space and aloha from Earth. This is Gemini Brett of More Than Astrology, here with my dear friend, Gary Caton, dream astrologer, to speak about Standing Rock and from an astrological perspective. So I think first it's very important to share our intentions here. And I just want to say personally that for me, astrology is an avenue to prayer. And I think it can very much distract us from being present and being in the body and being in the moment and experiencing life, because it can be very academic and intellectual. But when we reconnect our astrology also to the living heavens and the marriage of heaven and earth, the above and the below, and connect through the directions, and live not only in some cold academic astrology, but also in an embodied earth astrology, then we really find that we're connecting in such a way that we're living maybe even more of the moment. At least that's astrology for me. And my sense of Gary, when I experience Gary out under the stars, he and I relate in this way. So that's why I've asked Gary to come and bring his perspective, which is much wiser and more experienced in the astrological realms than my own. And we just look forward to sharing. So Gary, how are you? And what would you like to add to that?
Hey, Brett, I'm doing great, man. It's really, it's always a pleasure to hang out with you and to share space with you and to, practice this thing that we call astrology, and especially our particular form of it, which, you come from the school of Shamanic Astrology. And I, come from a place very similar, even though not necessarily having personally studied with Daniel Gemario, but Daniel himself has said, hey, you're one of us, you're doing what we're doing, come hang out, So yeah, it's a very interesting thing to bring something that actually started in Mesopotamia and Babylonia and Egypt as a way to understand the stars in the sky, and then got transformed by the Greeks into an earth-based zodiac, and then bring that to bear on a new world civilization that is, a completely different orientation. So it's a little bit of a crazy idea, but I think it's just crazy enough to be really cool. But most of all, just here from a heart space of wanting to support our brothers and sisters of the Sioux Nation in their struggle to keep from being stripped of the very last and most dear possession they have, the water. Water is life, and just want to be in solidarity with them and use the tools that I have to maybe help people understand their plight a little bit, and also to celebrate this thing that we do, that is astrology.
Yeah, so I want to read something. This is from the comments of a really wonderful documentary I encourage people to watch, and I'll put a link in the description here of this YouTube post. But it's called Red Cry, the documentary, Today's Genocide in America. And I mean, it's a heavy watch, but in the post here, they wrote that the Lakota Solidarity Project with the Strong Heart Warriors are issuing an international call to action for both Native and non-Native warriors, activists, artists, culture jammers, organizers, community builders, freedom fighters, Idle No More supporters, Occupy groups, indigenados, organizations, coalitions, networks, spiritual communities, elders, and youth to join us at this critical moment to help end the genocide of the traditional and grassroots Lakota Oyote and support the renewal of traditional matriarchal grandmother-led leadership. And you can read more here. It's beautiful. This was posted July 12th, 2013, which is a time that Gary and I'm sure we'll get to as we're speaking about astrology and some of the greatest energies of our time. So we plan to go slowly here. And I think we're going to look at, first of all, can we find a birth chart for Standing Rock Reservation in general, because this is one thing we do as astrologers, and then we can look at how the planetary alignments of the current time might speak to different energies and initiations and windows that are opening there. So again, you know, this is how I culture jam, I guess, according to the calling of that document. And this has been a thing for me as well. My Venus project, I recently interviewed Victory Lundquist, who's out there as the head of the medic tent at Standing Rock right now. And she's been dancing with the Lakota and sitting in prayer with Lakota for a long time. And you can watch that interview if you'd like. But one thing that really touched my heart when she came and spoke to our community here in Seattle when we were having a fundraiser for Standing Rock was just the open invitation for people of all cultures and all tribes to come and be a part of this great movement of solidarity, because this isn't just about Native people. It is certainly about that, but it is also about water and the land and these things that we care about. So we can also contribute through sending donations, but also just connecting in prayer and energy. And again, that's my intention here. So Gary, before we jump in, when we're looking at a nation or a place as a chart, I guess this question to ask, and I should just say, I assume listeners out here know about Standing Rock and know about the pipeline and these kinds of things. And if you don't, please look it up. I don't think we'll talk so much about the current politic as much as looking from this astrological lens. And in doing so, there's a tradition called mundane astrology. So Gary, could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yes, sir. So mundane astrology comes from the Latin word mundus, which means world, right? So most people nowadays use astrology to look at their personal life and to try to find some direction or meaning in their life. And that's a wonderful way to use astrology. But originally, you didn't do birth charts for individual people. You looked at astrology for direction for the king and or kingdom. So if there was an individual involved, it would have been the king or queen. But it was really looked at from a collective point of view of how are we as a people, what is the sky telling us, the sky being maybe an intermediary between the God and earth, right? These wandering stars, what are they telling us? How maybe they are closer to the mind of God and they can tell us what God wants us to do, yeah? So mundane astrology is astrology from that point of view. It's from a collective point of view rather than a personal point of view. Now, we can still identify individual actors within that larger perspective, but generally speaking, that's the difference. And of course, if we want to find a horoscope or a chart, you know, for a specific moment, we have to identify these crucial moments where something happened that changed history. And that becomes a foundational moment that we can look at the way the sky was arranged at that time and say, okay, this is the chart for that moment. And from this chart, we can begin to gain understanding of the meaning of this event. And we can begin to understand the ramifications of this event and so forth. And, you know, I looked on the Standing Rock website and saw that they themselves were mentioning the Treaty of Fort Laramie as a foundational event in their history, as being a nation formally recognized by the United States of America in a treaty. And so that's one moment that you can definitely use to try to begin to get a glimpse of what the wandering stars have to say. April 29th, 1868 was the Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed that set forth the initial boundaries of the Great Sioux Reservation, of which Standing Rock is a later division, unfortunately. But this was the original sort of formation of this land agreement between the United States of America and the Lakota Nation. Also, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were involved, I believe.
Yeah, and a couple other tribes. And I will link this standingrock.org history also in the descriptions here of YouTube, so you can follow this, because some of the timelines coming from here, there's a couple of documentaries that I've been watching as well that I'll link that bring in some different dates. But after the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, this entire parcel of land was given to many of the First Nations. It was actually 5% of what is now the United States territories, I guess. And there were different treaties passed that subdivided this land and moved. So we're going to actually move through that history a little bit during the course of this presentation in episodes. But the date that Gary mentions is the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. It was April 29th, 1868. And it was held at the Fort Laramie in Wyoming, but the chart that I've cast is in Standing Rock, South Dakota, okay? But for this date, April 29th, 1868. So now in mundane astrology, it's interesting, but it's much easier to find a birth chart, if you will, for a nation if there has been some type of agreement like this or some kind of declaration. For example, the United States chart, usually people use the July 4th, 1776 as the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of controversy around that alone about when the document was actually signed, but was
only amongst astrologers is there controversy. Pretty much everyone in the world recognizes July 4th, 1776 as the founding day of the United States, right?
Right. So, you know, this would be a time when Standing Rock Reservation, in a sense, was really born. It's been divided in different ways through other treaties and broken promises since. But this is a date that we can use. And then it's about finding, for we astrologers, a time. And when you don't have a proper time, often the sunrise chart is used. So, Gary, could you tell us a little bit about why sunrise?
Right. There's a tradition where you can look at more than one chart for various things. You can look, for instance, if a person is born at a particular time of day, you can look at that actual birth chart for the person, but you would still look at other charts. They're called derivative charts. And one of the charts you would look at is called a Surya Lagna. This is actually from the Vedic or Indian or Hindu tradition. Where you would rotate the chart for that moment of sunrise. And I think in the case of indigenous people who lived, you know, in harmony with the earth and on the land, sunrise is a very sacred moment for them. That it seems very appropriate. It seems like the most honest point to use, because it's actually the birth of that day on which this famous event occurred, and we really don't know. You know, we have no way of knowing what time they signed this thing. So sunrise seems like a pretty honest way to frame the moment.
Right, and there won't be too much shift in some regards throughout the course of the day. So I think maybe we'll just talk about how we use time of charts briefly in astrology. And I'll share my screen again. We can look at this chart together. So this is the moment that the sun was rising. So we can just look at what time the same degree in minutes, 9 degrees, 24 minutes Taurus. So the sun was at the ascendant. This is what's rising. This is east. So as the earth is spinning this way, and the earth is in the middle of these astrology charts, we see everything rising in the east. For those of us in the northern hemisphere, culminating in the south, which is up here, and then setting in the west. And everything else here is below the ground. Okay, so this is an image of sunrise. If I just move forward by an hour, that's the sun now having risen. And so one thing that changes here, I'm going to actually clear out some of these asteroids and other points. And, you know, I think at some point I'll bring in a little decoder ring of the glyphs and stuff for those of you out there that might be watching that aren't too familiar with astrology yet. But one of the key components in astrology is called the houses or the places. And those are defined by the time and the place of the chart. So other key components are the planets themselves, like the sun and the moon and Venus and Mercury and Mars. And also the signs like Leo and Cancer and Gemini and Taurus and Aries. But then the houses or the places tend to be one of the key components of astrological delineation and even prediction. So it gets a little bit questionable when we don't necessarily have a birth time, but we don't need all of that information to do good astrology. So the one thing just planetarily that's going to change quickly is the moon. The moon moves pretty rapidly, 13 degrees per day. So you can see the moon here is at 5 degrees 44 minutes Leo at 4:54 a.m. at sunrise. If I just go a couple hours ahead, that's 3 hours. We're already at 7 degrees in 30 minutes. So that's one thing that will change pretty quickly. But otherwise, most of the planets are going to be in the same degree for the entire day. So one thing that we lose is the houses, and the house.
I don't think so.
Yeah, please tell me about that, Gary.
Well, I'm pretty confident in using these solar houses, actually. In other words, if I'm writing a horoscope column for a newspaper or other publication, which I do frequently as an astrologer, and I'm writing to Aries, I'm writing to all of those people in the world that were born in the month between, March 20th and April 20th, right? And I'm going to speak to them about things that are happening in the sky right now. For instance, there's a big lineup in Sagittarius. Well, it's pretty simple, you can use your fingers if you need to, but from Aries through to Sagittarius, there are 9 signs. If you count forward from Aries, by the time you get to Sagittarius, you reach 9. So it's the 9th slice of pie, the 9th slice of sky from Aries. And so that becomes a way of calling a house or a sector or a slice or whatever you want to call it, a place. And I've seen these work really well. And so I think you don't necessarily have to lose the houses. You understand, of course, that you don't want to base everything in your interpretation on this part of what we do, because, of course, it's not based on a known time. But at the same time, I wouldn't go as far as throwing them out altogether.
Thank you for that. Let me show one quick other image that might bring people into more awareness of what the chart is. So I'll share the screen here again. And we'll go back to the chart wheel. While I'm up here, I'm going to bring in a bit of a decoder ring here. Let me hide our cameras. So people who are going to follow the series, you can maybe take a screenshot here, and then you'll just be able to see this is Saturn by checking it against the glyphs here, and see that this is Sagittarius by looking at the glyphs here too. And we'll go into that definitely in more detail.
So here's an example of solar houses really quickly, right? So here we have the sun in Taurus rising, right? So if we count forward, Taurus is 1, Gemini is 2, Cancer is 3, Leo is 4, right? Well, it's interesting, first of all, that we have the moon in the 4th house. And this is a treaty describing land boundaries and the home range of a particular tribe. 4th house is home, right? But anyway, keep going. We go 5th house is the next earth sign, Virgo. 6th house is Libra. 7th house is Scorpio. 8th house is Sagittarius. We have Saturn in the 8th house. The 8th house is often described as shared resources, right? Saturn is a planet that is often associated with real estate. Here we have the demarcation of tribal lands that belong to many people. And, there you go, 8th house. I mean, it seems pretty clear symbolism there, which is like that gives me an idea. Okay, I can work with this chart because
Saturn's
it's speaking my
also
language.
Saturn's also retrograde, and we'll get back to that. And then some pretty strong alignments with other planets here. Is what's called a grand fire trine happening. And that speaks to me in ways because one of the teacups that I drew, I have teacups for these different planets, but I also have one for the fire element, and that's one that came up this morning when I was thinking about this session. So Gary's talking about when we look at each sign as a house or a place, like Taurus 1, Gemini 2, Cancer 3, etc. This is whole sign astrology. Every sign gets a house. It's the oldest system known. The original chart I had up here is called a porphyry system. It's also very old, and there's a significant difference here. I mean, you can just see it geometrically, but I enjoy using many different house systems. The whole sign for a lot of the old techniques that we'll be speaking about, especially Gary. Gary's one of my teachers for traditional astrology. But the porphyry system, or the other what are called quadrant house systems, I also very much like, because they tie the chart to the cardinal directions of the earth, which of course is so important to indigenous and native wisdoms worldwide. And I want to show a little bit about how the chart isn't just some strange map. It's one thing, which maybe we'll look at another time. It's a geocentric or earth-centered. The middle here is the earth, image of the planetary alignments at this moment in time. But it's also a snapshot of the sky. So I'm going to go over here to a great astronomy program called Stellarium, and I've got this moment in time dialed up. And so this is the sun rising here in the east. Taurus actually rises north of east, which is happening here. And you can see Mercury, Neptune, Mars, and Jupiter all kind of huddled together. That's going on right here, Mercury, Neptune, Mars, and Jupiter. So this line, which is called the midheaven of a chart, and for us in the northern hemisphere, it's due south because it's where the meridian, or the north-south line, intersects the ecliptic. This is the plane of our solar system, or the path that the sun takes during the course of the year through the constellations and the signs of the zodiac. And pretty much the planets stay true to that line as well, for our solar system is relatively flat. Different story with Pluto, and we'll get back to that. But this is the midheaven. And one of the reasons why the quadrant house systems really speak to me is because they tie the chart, which isn't necessarily tied to the east or the west, as many people teach about the rising and setting sign. That's only true twice a day. But this part of the chart is always in a cardinal direction. So why I enjoy the porphyry system that we'll look at a bit, and we'll certainly be looking at whole sign system, is it's just totally space-based, and I can see it with my face under clear skies, because it just takes this section of sky from the midheaven to the rising sign and splits it into 3 equal geometries. And the same for this section of sky between the setting sign and the midheaven. So if I take the ground away, what we're going to see is the rest of the chart. And I got to kind of zoom up here. This is the horizon now. Everything on this red line is this. So below the horizon, the rest of the ecliptic. So just, that's too brief, but a very quick introduction to how the chart is also the sky. And this is really important to Gary and myself, who participate with the living sky. We're very much engaged with archaeoastronomy, or real astronomy, the old way of looking with the telescopes called our face and engaging with these planets who, for me, and I think I can speak for Gary in this regard too, are beings, are conscious beings who are participating with us energetically.
No doubt. No doubt. I can tell you firsthand experience that they are beings and they want to communicate with you. And you have to get out there with them like anything else. You have to form a relationship, and you have to tend to that relationship to receive these communications. But there is no doubt in my mind that these are living beings that you can communicate with, and both through this symbolic medium, which is fine, the chart, these are abstractions that we can use when we're not able to be out under the sky. But getting out under the actual sky and encountering these bright lights is a whole nother way of experiencing this. And I recommend that people, you know, incorporate that into their practice as well as what we're doing here, without a doubt. I think in terms of experiential, it's, you know, it's a really good thing to notice here that we're talking about sunrise, and you notice that there was a group of planets that were arrayed just out in front of the sun as the sun was rising. There was a whole array of planets that were preceding the sun across the horizon at the moment, at dawn, right? So on the morning of this treaty, if one of our brothers and sisters of the Lakota Nation back then were to step out of their teepees and look towards the east, they would have seen Jupiter and Mars and Mercury all greeting them as morning stars there in the east. And it's interesting, really fascinating to me for a few reasons. First of all, remember there were 3 different tribes that were being represented by this treaty. There were the Sioux, there were the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. And there were also at least 3 different major warriors that made this treaty possible, the main one being Red Cloud. This treaty was a peace treaty that served to conclude what's known as Red Cloud's War. Right, so there's Mars, the red planet rising, and this treaty is to conclude Red Cloud's War. I mean, how cool is that? You know what I'm saying? And the other thing that's really fascinating is that the Greeks would have called these planets Doryphory, D-O-R-Y-P-H-O-R-Y. And the best translation we have of this word is spear bearer. In other words, these planets that rise just before the sun, the sun is seen as the king. And so any good king would have an advanced guard that would go in front of him and protect him, right? We call them civil service here or the Secret Service. Civil service is a different deal. But the king has, you know, his posse. And so here you have these spear bearers in the morning sky, you know, going before, and you have, you know, a nation of people who actually make their living as spear bearers. And I just, once again, I think, okay, wow, it's speaking to me, you know. And so as a person whose job is to interpret star speech, astrologos, star speech, I'm hearing stuff I can make sense of, and so I can do my job with this chart.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much about this chart really speaks to what my heart hears when I tune into the wisdom of the elders. And I think one beautiful thing about Standing Rock right now, I mean, it's such a challenge, but to see these people come together and to hear the voice of the land spoken through people who live their life connected to it. And this reminder that this is what it is to be a true human being. Yeah. And so we're called to reconnect too. I mean, this is one of the things that called me to Gary when we first met. We both presented at one of the Shamanic Astrology conferences. And Gary came to astrology through a dream. Gary connects as well to animal spirits as I do, you know, in our own way. And so it's, for me, again, the planets are like those animal spirits, you know, or like the spirits of the elements or the directions, and they speak and they're totally available to us. So I think that a last thing about experiential astrology, because we'll look to this in a few different ways as we move forward. We'll delineate, I guess, this chart. We'll speak about the different planets and the signs and these angles and these kinds of things as we do as astrologers. But something we'll also do that not all astrologers do is look at, well, what was happening with Mercury during the course of his cycle, a 4-month cycle on average with the sun. He's a morning star. What does that mean? what does it mean that Venus is an evening star, very advanced in her 19-month cycle? What is it that the moon not only is in the sign of Leo, but is a first quarter moon, is at that phase, you know? And so this is sky astrology. In fact, Gary, and I really encourage you to check it out, is a member of a 3-star astrologer team, so star I can't even speak, called the Sky Astrology Conference, and you can find them at skyastrologyconference.com. It's Adam Gainsberg and Julian Packard-Lewis and Gary, and they do incredible webinars.
There's 4 of us now.
Well, who's 4?
Andrea Michelle Kennedy, she's 4th, and
Wonderful.
And if you mind your P's and Q's, you might be on tap at some point yourself there.
Nice. Well, let's all join in. But this is literally like experiencing the sky, right? So yes, we can talk about a Leo moon, and that's wonderful. But what is it that it was the waxing half moon? We can speak about a Gemini Venus, and that's wonderful. But what is it that she was high and bright in the evening after sunset at this time? What is it that she's aligned to a very sacred place of the sky to many traditions, including the Lakota tradition, I understand. So we'll be looking at that. And I really encourage people, when I bring people out under the sky and I try to experience this, when people say, oh, I don't know anything, I just want to know. And it's like, that's it. Like, capture that, remember that, because what do you know? What do you feel right now? And just that awe that we have when we look up and experience the heavens, especially when, and it's hard these days, right? When we can find our way to dark skies and see the Milky Way and see our local neighborhood and these kinds of things. So I wanted to add one thing about this chart, and maybe this will be good for episode 1, Gary, and then we can cruise into speaking about the Taurus sun and the Leo moon and these kinds of things. I'll certainly invite you to add a statement before we close. One thing that amazes me about this chart, for the sunrise chart, when we look from Standing Rock, is it puts Capricorn here at the midheaven. So we saw that in the sky of where the north-south line intersects the ecliptic and the zodiac. And Capricorn in so many ways is the elder. It is the trunk and the roots of the world tree. And this 10th house, or this cusp that with the midheaven, it speaks about, in a way, the job or the vocation of this nativity or this chart. And so one thing that we will see again and again, I think, as we look astrologically at this Standing Rock chart, is the great gift of the wisdom of the earth returning to ears that maybe have not been taught to hear it, you know, as so many in our culture, including myself, not, and you. So the plan to move forward here is to kind of take these characters one at a time in a course of short episodes where we speak about what is a Taurus sun and what is a Leo moon and these kinds of things. And then we'll look through some of the significant historical happenings. The Black Hills were taken from the Lakota reservations, or the native reservations. And then we'll look ahead and see what's happening this year and next year according to this chart, as we do in astrological predictive technique. And my warning there is we have to walk a thin line of what is predictive and what is productive. So we'll see if we can dance diligently in that regard. I just want to finish saying personally that today is November 1st. Things are really heating up at the Standing Rock Reservation and at the Missouri River, where water protectors are defending the sacred water and the land. And I really hope you'll tune in and connect any way that you can. That's part of my intention here, is just to be in prayer. It's interesting that George Bush Sr. declared November as American Indian month. Okay, so just that phrase alone speaks to the irony that we wish to connect to the wisdom of this land's First Nations. And I just, as like a disclaimer, I've been raised calling these people Indians, and it's hard not to go there where I know Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, and especially First Nations is a more true description of who they are. So I just want to say, like, up front that I will be as careful as I can not to dip into the realms of cultural appropriation or speaking out of line. And when I do, please know that I'm coming from my heart here. So Gary, do you have anything you want to share as we end episode 1?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that what you said is really important to say. That, you know, these people were here first. That's why they're called First Nations. You know, and there's a tremendous history of wrongdoing by the white people, and you know, we certainly don't want to add to that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. And if we do, please forgive us for our ignorance and for our blundering. But we come to this with the intention of honor and love and peace, right? And understanding. There's a great prophecy that is, I'm not sure if it's particular to any of the First Nations, but it talks about a whirling rainbow, and that there will be a time when there will actually be white people who have red hearts, yeah, who have native hearts, and they will participate in things in a native fashion or along with the native people. And you know, it's hard to tell. It's kind of like in astrology, we have something similar called the Age of Aquarius, and nobody knows when it's coming or even if it's coming exactly. But I would like to hope that maybe I could be one of those people who could find some place in my heart that is able to share, you know, with these people in their struggles and to stand in solidarity with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we look at these historical happenings, you know, part of what these sharings will be about is to help us tune into these timelines and some of these events that are really hard to swallow for people whose ancestors were on the wrong side of this thing. Yeah. So It's not uncommon for me. I'm a white male born into, you know, middle-class society. Haven't really struggled for a home or for food. And when I'm looking into sexism and racism and these things, it's hard not to feel like I should be guilty or something. That's not where I want to be. That doesn't bring healing. So my intent is to raise my own personal awareness of this. And if I can spread that, to bring some healing in my own heart. And this connects me to prayer to a people who have long been abused. And it's time for us to stop that. So the more that we can be aware, the more that we can courageously go into the places that can be difficult for us, the more healing we will have in our own selves and the more healing we will have as a collective. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Aho.
Oh, all right, brother. Well, this is the end of episode 1, the introduction and intention. And we will continue by starting to look at this chart from an astrological perspective. So thanks for tuning in. And I invite any astrologers out there and anyone to share, hey, I'd like to hear more about this. I'd like to share about this. I want to come on and share my piece, whatever. So leave a comment in the YouTube, if you will. And thanks for spending your time with us. Love and planets to you. We will
Love and planets
in space.